Welcome back. I'm down here in the corner. Hello. Okay, so here's where we start this part. So now we're going to actually talk about the mind a little bit, and again, our kids are in school in this middle childhood period. They're just getting to school, and for the first time in their lives, they're being graded. They're being measured. They are being compared. They are comparing themselves. So let's start with this question, though. How do you define intelligence? Because this becomes kind of a big area of recognition once we get to school. Where does our intelligence lie? How do our children measure up? How are they doing in school and all of this kind of stuff? So think about that for a moment. How do you define intelligence? Because whether or not we want it to be, when kids go to school, this becomes part of their reality, is how other people are going to judge their intelligence against everybody else's, how they're going to, and how their intelligence is going to be measured and tested and all of this kind of stuff. So think about that, because this is an entire study in psychology, is how do we define, how do we measure, and what do we do with the knowledge around intelligence? And it's a really old story that began a long time ago. Well, actually, we say that in the mid to late 1800s, we really started looking at intelligence. And the first person to do this, one of the ones I want to talk about as being the first, is Francis Galton. Francis Galton was Charles Darwin's half cousin, or something like that. And through work of his own, he traveled a lot to Africa. He kind of world traveled, and also reading Darwin's, seminal work on evolution of the species, he decided, or came to deeply believe, that intelligence is genetic. And so for humans, just like with animals and so forth, that the strongest survive, and that this was true with intelligence as well. And that that this is all passed down. And so Galton was father of what maybe some of you have ever heard of, the eugenics movement. And eugenics, through Galton, this is a hard one. And it really, if you study this, I'm not going to go deep into this. If you study this, there's some dark stuff in it that doesn't leave us feeling very good, maybe about our history. But this is kind of just where we've been, where we've come from, and what we need to learn from. But for Galton, what he really wanted to answer, and he was, how do we alleviate poverty in England? How do we get rid of that? This was some of it. And so if you combine that, and also, just as an aside, around 1900, the work of Mendel with genetics came out big. It actually came out earlier, but it was sort of lost in Darwin's stuff. So we have sort of these studies of genetics and evolution coming out around the same time. And it really was Galton in the beginning of all of this where we brought about this whole idea of nature versus nurture. And nature was winning among many. And so the beginning of this eugenics movement, eugenics basically EU, meaning good, so good genes. And if we were going to alleviate poverty or problems, then what we needed to do was look at the best genes in the best genetic pools and determine how we strengthen those. How we get the strong genes that we see based on our ideas of what's good and bad to continue to reproduce. And how we get the bad genes not to. And so, by their observation and their judgment, the belief being that the poor, and also not just the poor, but the disabled, any kind of slow or cognitive issues being bad genes. And even to the point of suggesting, as Galton did, and those that came through him, after him, Galton even has some quote about that for these people, monasteries would be a good place, that we just need to keep them from reproducing. And this became big, this idea that we needed to just elevate the good genes and de-escalate the bad, to get rid of the problems in society. And the idea that, and the way that in early days, and Galton had some very like tests that he gave, and it would be like the shape of your skull and the strength of your grip and your eyesight. So blind people would fall to bad genes or feeble-mindedness. And we used to, we actually had in the early 1900s, 1920s and so forth, this became big in America and Germany. And of course, Hitler kind of took hold of this whole eugenics movement. Now, for Galton, there was actually a real deep passion and belief in terms of how we help things, of course, and it was misguided. Not the evil intention of like a Hitler, but still it was the father in the beginning of some of this. But in America, this became very big. I mean, we had institutions, as they did in Europe, of things like the Institute for the Feeble-Minded, and they had measurement systems of like idiot. Now, these weren't just, we use these terms as slang. These were actual categories of people. Idiot, imbecile, and moron. I can't remember exactly which order they went in terms of best to worst, but these were the categories that they put people in to name them. And so then we had these institutes for the feeble-minded. And a lot of our just like autistic, Asperger, people that, we've learned so much more about this now, but just, and of course those that, would be considered retarded. And Hitler took all of this, of course, to just another horrifying degree. But there were other pretty bad things that went on. I think it might have been in Germany, but other than that, there was an institution where children were kept that were feeble-minded, and they sent out a letter to parents just basically asking, if you knew that your child could die painlessly, basically, this is what it was saying, if they were found to be feeble-minded and if they could die painlessly, would you okay that? And the saddest part about it is that a lot of those things came back and said, we'd rather not know. But not know, of course not. And so, and even in America, the movement for, and I believe, this is sort of where my knowledge of some of this stops, but passing of laws for mandatory sterilization of those considered feeble-minded and so forth. So we've come a long way, and then we had other things going on with other people, of course, where intelligence was concerned. And Binet and intelligence tests actually developed in France for how do we begin to, how do we serve the needs of those who are cognitively slower. And so they were trying to find ways, and so that's where one of the original intelligence tests came about, was with Binet in France, which then moved over to America and found more of a home with the eugenics movement than Binet had, but was redeveloped by Louis Terman, and found it's now called the Stanford Binet test. And it's still given in terms of an IQ test, but of course, hopefully we've come a long way from those roots, but things to remember. So let's move on back to text kind of stuff. Measuring the mind. We have two different ways that we do that, kind of through aptitude tests. That's the potential. Aptitude is the potential to master a skill or knowledge. This is where IQ, which is what I was just talking about with Binet, the first kind of IQ test. Now there's the Wechsler, the WISC-4, which is given, or the WISC test, which is given for IQ tests. Originally, intelligence was defined as the mental age, and that's not mental age divided by the chronological age. The chronological age is how old you are. The mental age is how it's determined where, say, in a pool of 48-year-olds, where do I measure? Am I above or below that? Is my mental age older than that, right there, or below that? And so they would do tests to measure the mental age and get sort of this intelligence quotient, or this IQ. We came up with this idea of just one intelligence, this little g, general intelligence thought. Spearman was the one who kind of came up with that originally, and really thought that there was this thing in the mind that master control of all kinds of intelligence called G. We still test for IQ, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. We also have achievement tests, a measure of mastering a specific subject. So that's like, you do that in classrooms all the time for achievement, but it's also considered some of those, this testing that we do like crazy. These standardized tests are more achievement tests, not IQ tests. Flint Effect, very briefly, there's been an average rise in IQ over decades that seems to be plateauing out. But we can say that this can be due to better health, smaller families, more schooling, and also that more people get to go to school for longer. It used to be once you were out of like primary education, that was it. People didn't go on to high school. So education seems to have an impact on IQ, which we didn't, haven't always been sure about. But the more education people get and the more exposure to things, we're seeing this general rise in IQ. So what does it look like? In theory, most are average. So this is for IQ. So if we look at 100 as absolute average, that's where that comes from. Average is considered between 85 and 115. Every 15 points, is kind of another stepping stone. And so we consider, it's like, see, from 115 to 130, it kind of jumps up by 15 points. Or jumps down by 15 points. And this 85 to 115 is average, and from here we move down, from here we move up. Is any of this valuable? Because there's a lot of criticisms about testing. No test can measure the complexities of the human brain. Studies show that people inherit a set of abilities and not a general intellectual ability. Person's potential changes with time. And tests reflect the culture of the makers. So how accurate are these things? I will tell you what I believe to be the value of IQ tests, that what the information they give you is not just a simple number. They do help you to have a profile of how a child learns and where strengths are and where maybe deficits are. And that's what I would see. My son was tested because he was having just some problems in second grade, not academic problems, not cognitive problems, but more just struggles with his teacher and challenges in the classroom. And so we wanted to get a feel for what we were looking at and what and here's what I learned. I learned a lot about how my son learns. I learned that he's a visual spatial learner, which is not promoted in most school systems. I learned that his strengths are his visual spatial and his verbal learning. He is more up here in this range, but I did learn that his deficits are in his processing speed, how quickly he processes information, and in his working memory. And so this can give me an understanding of when he gets frustrated and why he gets frustrated, and what the hard parts are, what the easy parts are, what's going to bore him. Not that it makes all the answers clear, but it definitely gives made answers clear enough to us to change schools. But it can give a snapshot and a profile of your child that can be beneficial. I think, if the information is used and understood correctly. What's interesting for school systems, we get, school systems will request this kind of testing or so forth for, because they need to know if people are not performing. If children are not performing, then they want to know, do they need special education? Do they need special accommodations? And so that can happen. We have tag programs, talented and gifted programs that will do sort of mini tests to figure out if students need something more on this end. Our school systems are definitely, more concerned with this end because there's only so many resources to go around, and they want everybody to sort of be achieving to this at least average level or to the passing level. So that's kind of an overview of IQ. And then we come into the idea of multiple intelligences. So there are those out there who really do not like this whole idea of, make sure I have the right idea of one general intelligence, that have fought more for this idea of general intelligences. And there's two people we're going to talk about. That's Sternberg and, do I not have the right? Yeah, I do. Sternberg and Howard Gardner. And so Sternberg suggests three types of intelligences: academic, creative, and practical. This idea is that we have many different types of intelligences out there, his being three. Now, please don't get, we don't have to read all of this. I'm going to read a little bit of this to you. This is from Sternberg specifically, that he looks at that some people do one thing really well and some people do another really well. And that he looks at some intelligence comes from capitalizing on our strengths and being able to sort of work with our weaknesses. And one thing, some of the time, practical intelligence comes into play with the ability to be adaptable to how we use our different intelligences. So one thing he says is that sometimes you change yourself to fit an environment, and that's called adaptation. Well, let me go back a little. I'm sorry. So they correct their weaknesses. They make themselves better at whatever it is they didn't do so well by adapting to, shaping, and selecting environments. I find this interesting. I give a little test to students in class that kind of deal with trying to figure out how they use these. So let's just talk for a minute about them. To adapt is to change yourself to fit an environment. So if you start a new job or new relationship, you change yourself to fit it to some extent. Shaping means that you try to shape the environment around you. So you might try to modify the job or change the relationship with a person to kind of fit your needs of what you hoped it would be. Selecting means that you just opt out, you get out. Being successfully intelligent means knowing when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Wrong job, wrong relationship, wrong place to live. And being able to get out of that and is a sense of intelligence, knowing what needs to be done within a particular situation. This says because this was actually quoted from Sternberg. I just copy and pasted, and they should all have quotes on them. Through a combination of analytical, creative, and practical abilities. You need creative skills to come up with ideas, analytical abilities to know whether they're good, and to evaluate the ideas. You need practical abilities to make your ideas work. So if we were in class together, one of the questions that you can, this isn't actually on this little test, but so think about it. Imagine that you're, this is one of the ones that I use because I see it. You're in a restaurant and you get your food and you don't like it. What do you do? Do you just eat it and adapt to the situation as it is? Do you speak to the waiter, try to change it? Or do you just leave or opt out of the whole thing altogether? It can also be like classes. One of the ones that it gives as an example. If you're not if you don't have time to study or something's not going well in a class, will you try to adapt your schedule and your situation for the class? Will you talk to the professor and try to get them to shape the class that will work for you? Do you opt out and drop the class? And there's no right or wrong in terms of each situation will require kind of a different way of being. I think what I like to say to students is, what's important to know is it's kind of like, do you have a stress style? Do you have a style in these? Are you an adapter by nature, a shaper by nature, or a selector by nature? If you have the capacity to use all of these and be flexible within them, read the situation, determine what needs to be done, I think that's what Sternberg was talking about. If we find ourselves always sort of doing one, and I get a lot of adapters in class, or a lot of people that will be just one style, the question again becomes, how's it working? And to know, like I had a student once who said that after kind of reading this and studying this, her daughter was having trouble at her job, and she said to her something to the effect of, well, you have some choices. You can either adapt to the situation, like she used these, adapt to the situation as it is, see how you can make it more okay for you. You can try to shape it, see what you can change within the environment, or you can leave. And you have to determine what's best for you and what's capable for you. So it becomes a way of thinking about situations that we always have choices. And if we only think about our choices, at least in these ways, we can do that. We can but try to determine, how do we then try to shape? How do we then adapt? And what do we do if we select? So there's choices within those, but we always have those three. So I just find that interesting. So that's Robert Sternberg, and his intelligence is of creative, analytical, or academic. Sometimes that one's called creative, analytical / academic, and practical. And practical is a lot of times considered like street smarts. When I owned a yogurt store, I had students. I'm sorry. Well, I did. Most of them were young people, but working for us, and some of them just could come to the register and handle like all these different things in terms of what was going on, and they were just really comfortable in that situation of managing all these situations. And I would call them as having sort of that practical intelligence of managing the people and being there with them in the cash register, and just kind of coolly competent in this kind of situation, which many of them were much better at that than me. So I admired that. All right, so here's Gardner. Gardner is still very much used in school systems and education systems. Let me check something really quick. All right, I want to make sure I have the right things here. So intelligence refers to the computational power of a mental system. So what that means, basically, Gardner saw he now has 9 intelligences, and he does believe that each of these has we'll explain it, but this is all based on our brain's ability and capacity to do these things well, that we have sort of an innate ability towards these particular things. For example, a person whose linguistic intelligence is strong is able readily to compute information that involves language. Whether a person likes to use certain intelligence is not the same as a strength in it. So I might love music, but have only mediocre musical intelligence. So it's not connecting like your passion for something with your intelligence for it. It is an innate brain-based ability towards certain things. So his original 7 he named in the early 1980s: linguistic, logical, mathematical, and you can go to the PowerPoint and kind of look even more closely at these: musical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, which is social understanding between people, intrapersonal, which is a self-understanding within yourself. In the mid-1990s, he added naturalistic, which is going to be understanding living things and reading nature. And existential. I know he's added this one, and I had a quote where he said he was looking into it. I do believe it's been added. It was the last one. He looked at like spiritual intelligence for a while. I think he's come to more of this existential, tackling the question of why we live and why we die. So I have uploaded a little online test you can take. I believe I do, to see which would be your strength. I believe I have that on there. So it's kind of interesting to look at. So here's some of Howard Gardner's quotes. Are the chess player, violinist, and athlete intelligent in these pursuits? If they are, then why do our tests of intelligence fail to identify them? If they are not intelligent, what allows them to achieve such astounding feats? In general, why does the contemporary construct intelligence fail to take into account large areas of human endeavor? A desire of selecting intelligences, this is what he had, a desire of selecting, why did he choose these 9 or these 8 or 7 original ones? that are rooted in biology and that are valued in one or more cultural settings. So he had standards for why he chose what he chose. In coming up with the list, I reviewed knowledge about normal development and development in gifted individuals, information about the breakdown of cognitive skills under conditions of brain damage, studies of exceptional populations, prodigies, idiot savants, autistic children, data about the evolution. So he did a lot of research. Only those candidate intelligences that satisfied all or a healthy majority of the criteria were selected as bona fide intelligences. So he looked at everything. Each intelligence must have an identifiable core operation or set of operations. As a neurally based computational system, each intelligence is activated or triggered by certain kinds of internally or externally presented information. For example, one core of musical intelligence is the sensitivity to pitch relations, whereas one core of linguistic is the sensitivity to phonological features. So these are neurally based, that we have innate capacities towards this ability. There are going to be some people that have sensitivity to pitch relations, where others don't. They might love music, but they don't have this capacity. So he believed they have to have brain-based, neurally based systems within the brain that account for these strengths. And then he, would choose based upon these things. So if we go back to these and you take your test, one thing I like to ask students is to consider which of these would have a difficulty in a standard mainstream classroom. Maybe not our linguistic, not our logical, mathematical. To some extent, maybe musical, spatial, certainly bodily kinesthetic may show up to teachers as ADHD. We like people to work in teams. Intrapersonal maybe are introverts and have a little bit of a difficult time. Naturalists are going to want to be outside, touching things, doing things. My son's best friend in second grade was definitely a naturalistic intelligence, and she did horribly on paper and pen type tests, horribly in spelling and math. And I really worried that she would get over, they were bringing in whole teams of people to see how they could help, because our schools want kids to be raised up to pass these tests. But I didn't want her gifts to be overlooked and then her to label herself as dumb or slow because it was showing up differently. And this is what we have to be careful of. What kind of just because we don't have the kind that is standard in our classrooms, are we missing something of true genius in some of our kids? And that can be a problem. And then I talk a lot about this. Now, since the 1990s, we have emotional intelligence, the ability to regulate one's emotions and perceptive understanding of other feelings, which are going to fall a lot into interpersonal and intrapersonal for Gardner. John Mayer, who was not the singer, the psychologist, had 3 emotional styles he talked about in intelligence. People who are self-aware, they have good emotional management. People who are engulfed, overwhelmed and out of control, mercurial, unaware, or controlled by emotion. People who are accepting, aware of the feelings, but accept them or try to do little to change them. This can lead to resignation when things aren't good. So this is just another form of intelligence. I'm going to stop this here, and we're going to do another little one on kids with special needs. But this is our intelligence. There are some supportive materials as well.